Black Elk, also known as Hehaka Sapa, was a Sioux boy who participated in the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876. At just 13 years old, he bravely scalped a soldier during the battle. As a second cousin to the legendary Crazy Horse, who played a significant role in the battle, Black Elk had a unique perspective on the events that unfolded. He was a witness to the chaos and intensity of the fighting and saw the bravery of the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors as they defeated the 7th Cavalry Regiment led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. Black Elk's eyewitness account of the Battle of Little Bighorn provides valuable insights into one of the most pivotal moments in American history. But before we begin, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel to support our community. No white men survived the fray with Custer. A battle swiftly concluded in broad daylight. Crazy Horse, that stalwart leader, had already vanquished General Crook's forces on the Rosebud that very day. I dare say, he could have annihilated the soldiers had he chosen to summon more warriors from our villages and lay in ambush at dawn, for they had camped in the dark after the fight. He had previously routed the cavalry that attacked our village on the Powder River that freezing March morning in the moon of the Snowblind. Thence, he moved west to the Rosebud, and when the soldiers came to attack us, he repelled them. Finally, he moved to the valley of the Greasy Grass, our ancestral land, where we sought only to be left in peace. 2 days prior to the battle, we established our camp in the valley, along the south side of the Greasy Grass, before the sun reached its zenith. Our village was vast, with teepees beyond count. Upstream to the south lay the Hunkpapas, followed by the Aglalas, the Miniconjuus, the Sanarks, the Blackfeet, and the Cheyennes, with the Santis and Yanktonai furthest to the north. On the eastern side flowed the Greasy Grass, swollen from snowmelt in the Bighorn Mountains, with timber along its banks. From a hill, one could espy the mountains to the south and west. Hills and bluffs rose across the river, with several gullies cutting through the cliffs. To the west lay lower hills, where we grazed and guarded our ponies, which numbered beyond count. A warrior named Rattling Hawk, though slain, having been shot in the hip during the combat on the Rosebud, was healed by a medicine man named Harry Chin. The day before the battle, I had anointed myself and was about to swim with some boys when Harry Chin summoned me to Rattling Hawk's teepee, requiring my assistance. 5 other boys were present, and he needed us to assume the guise of bears in the curing ceremony, for his power derived from a dream of the bear. He painted my body and face yellow, with black stripes on either side of my nose, and tied my hair to resemble bear ears, adorning my head with eagle feathers. As he did so, I recalled my vision, and suddenly, I felt lifted off the ground. In that instant, I comprehended more than I could express, and felt certain that some calamity would soon befall us. I was filled with trepidation. The other boys were painted entirely in red, with real bear ears on their heads. Harry Chin, attired in a genuine bear hide, began singing thus: "At the doorway, the sacred herbs are rejoicing." 2 females entered, standing on either side of the injured warrior, one holding a cup of water, the other some manner of herb. As I gazed upon the cup, I endeavored to discern if it contained the entirety of the sky, as it had in my vision, but alas, I could not ascertain. Whilst the plant and cup were being presented to Rattling Hawk, Harry Chin continued to chant. Then, they bestowed upon him a crimson cane, and he arose forthwith. The injured warrior, supported by the sacred red stick, followed the ladies out of the teepee. We boys, masquerading as little bears, capered around him, emitting growling noises. Feathers of diverse hues protruded from our lips as we performed this ritual. Subsequently, Harry Chin emerged on all fours, bearing a striking resemblance to a bear, in my opinion. Rattling Hawk's gait improved, and though he was unable to engage in combat the following day, he recovered soon thereafter. We lads proceeded to swim, intent on removing the paint from our bodies after the ceremony. Upon our return, the villagers were engaged in dancing and recounting tales of valor from the battle with 3 stars on the Rosebud. We were tasked with bringing the ponies closer to the village at dusk. By the time we completed this task, night had fallen, and the villagers continued to dance around fires, their revelry unabated. We wandered from one dance to another, until fatigue overcame us, and we could no longer remain awake. At dawn, my father roused me, instructing me to accompany him to graze our horses. Whilst we were thus engaged, he admonished me to place a lengthy rope on one of the horses that we might easily capture it and thereby secure the others. He impressed upon me the importance of vigilance, cautioning me to keep a watchful eye on the camp and return the horses with all due haste, lest calamity strike. Several of us boys tended to our horses together until the sun reached its zenith and the heat became oppressive. We decided to seek respite in the water, and my cousin graciously offered to remain with the horses until our return. As I anointed myself with grease, I felt an eerie sense of foreboding, as if some terrible event was imminent. Nevertheless, I accompanied the boys to the water's edge. To the west of the village, a multitude of people were engaged in digging turnips, and a considerable number were already in the water. By the time my cousin brought the horses down to drink, we had been immersed for quite some time, the heat being intense. Suddenly, the crier's voice rang out in the nearby Hunkpapa camp. "The chargers are coming! They are charging! The chargers are coming!" Cries echoed from camp to camp, all the way to the Santis and Yanktonais. The Oglala crier repeated the same lines, his voice growing more urgent. Everyone hastened to secure their horses, and we were fortunate to have ours nearby. My older brother, mounted on a sorrel horse, rode swiftly toward the Hunkpapas. I had a buckskin horse. When my father heard my brother's cry and saw him ride toward the Hunkpapas without his pistol, he came running over, instructing me to retrieve it from him and return it to him, then return to me forthwith. Moreover, he had in his possession my six-shooter, an heirloom from my aunt. I seized the firearms, mounted my pony, and pursued my brother. Just beyond the Hunkpapa camp, a dense cloud of dust arose as the Hunkpapas, many of whom were still damp from the river, ran about and cried out in dismay. Out of the dust emerged the soldiers on their imposing horses, appearing tall and strong, and discharging their weapons. With his revolver in hand, my brother shouted at me to turn back. There was a thicket of brushy timber just beyond the Hunkpapas, and some warriors were congregating there. He headed in that direction, and I followed. Women and children were already fleeing downstream en masse. Looking back, I saw them all scattering up a hillside. When we reached the timber, many Hunkpapas were already there, and the soldiers were firing above us, causing leaves to fall from the trees where the bullet struck. The women and children were running. The warriors were riding in on their horses, and I was unable to discern what was transpiring in the hamlet below. It was all dust, screaming, and thunder. In the woods and outside the Hunkpapa camp, we all yelled, "Have bravery! Be not like a lady! The defenseless are panting heavily." I suppose this was the moment when Gaul intervened to prevent the Hunkpapas from fleeing. I remained in the woods for a while and pondered my vision. It imbued me with a greater sense of purpose and gave the impression that the army would be vanquished and that my people were all thunder beings. Subsequently, a loud cry resounded over the dust. "Crazy Horse is approaching." The arrival of Crazy Horse was heralded by the sound of eagle bone whistles and the yelling of "Hokahi," like a howling wind, coming from the north and west. The valley grew darker with dust and smoke, filled with shadows and a cacophony of cries, hoofbeats, and gunfire. To my left, I could hear the soldiers' horses, shod with iron hooves, retreating into the brush, with shooting erupting everywhere. The horses eventually broke through the undergrowth, and I was surrounded by a flurry of activity as men and horses entered and exited the area, traveling upstream while shouting, "Hurry! Move quickly!" We were all mingled together amidst the clamor and gloom as the troops ran upstream. I didn't see much, but I did witness a Lakota warrior charging at a soldier who stayed behind and fought valiantly. The Lakota grabbed the soldier's horse by the bridle, but the soldier shot him with a revolver. Being small, I couldn't push through to where the soldiers were, so I didn't kill anyone. Everything was gloomy and unclear, and there were far too many people in front of me. Soon, the soldiers and many Lakotas were all packed into the river, and I was in the water for a while. Men and horses were tangled up and fighting in the river, making it seem like hail was falling. After we emerged from the water, people began stripping the dead soldiers of their clothes and donning them themselves. One soldier on the ground was still moving. A Lakota rode up and said to me, "Boy, get off and scalp him." I dismounted and began to scalp him. His hair was short and my knife was dull. He was grinding his teeth, so I shot him in the forehead and then took his scalp. Many of our warriors were pursuing the soldiers up a hill on the other side of the river, while everyone else was moving downstream. On a distant hill above the Santee camp, there was a large cloud of dust with our warriors darting in and out of it like swallows, and many guns were firing. I decided to show my mother my scalp, so I rode toward the hill, where a group of women and children had gathered. On the way, I saw a beautiful young woman among a band of warriors heading toward the battle. She was singing, "Brothers, now your friends have arrived. Be brave, be brave. Do you want to see me captured?" As I rode through the Oglala camp, I saw Rattling Hawk sitting alone in his teepee with a gun in his hands. He was singing a mournful song that went like this: "What can you do, brothers, that I cannot accomplish?" When I reached the women on the hill, they were all singing and making a tremolo to encourage the fighters across the river. My mother gave a special tremolo just for me when she saw my first scalp. I stayed there for a while with my mother, watching the swirling dust on the hill across the river. Horses emerged from it with empty saddles. I spent some time with the women after showing my mother my first scalp. They were all tremoloing and singing. The thick dust from the battle obscured our view, but we knew the soldiers would be finished. Many boys around my age and younger were there with their mothers and sisters, and they asked me to join them at the battle. So we mounted our ponies and set off. We observed gray horses with empty saddles stampeding into the water as we rode downward toward the river. Reaching the mouth of a gulch that went up into the bluff where the action was taking place, we traversed the Greasy Grass. By the time we arrived, most of the soldiers were down, with many already dead, though some were still alive. More boys had gathered by then, and we rode around shooting arrows at the soldiers. I found one soldier writhing with arrows in him and began to take his coat, but a man pushed me aside and claimed it for himself. Then I noticed something shiny hanging from the soldier's belt. I pulled it out. It was a round, bright yellow object that was very beautiful. I put it on as a necklace. At first, it ticked, but then it stopped. I wore it around my neck for a long time before I figured out what it was and how to make it tick again. Then the women gathered around, and we climbed to the top of the hill. There, gray horses lay dead, some piled on top of soldiers, and soldiers on top of horses. We didn't see many of our own dead since they had been collected already, but many of our men were killed or injured. The dust from the battle rendered it challenging to discern clearly, and it was difficult to distinguish who was who. It didn't appear that anyone knew which soldier Pyan Hanska was, and I didn't espy him. I saw one soldier raising his arms and groaning, so I shot an arrow into his forehead, causing his arms and legs to twitch. I noticed some Lakotas endeavoring to assist another Lakota. When I approached, I realized it was Black Wasaku, the brother of Chase in the morning. He had been shot through his right shoulder, with the bullet lodging in his left hip as he was hanging off the side of his horse when he was struck. They were administering medicine to him. He was my cousin, and both his father and mine were so enraged by this that they went and killed a soldier and mutilated his body. The soldier was corpulent, and the meat appeared appetizing, but we didn't partake of it. There was a young boy, younger than me, who requested that I scalp a soldier for him. I did, and he ran off to show the scalp to his mother. The majority of the warriors drove the other soldiers back to the hill where their pack mules were while we were there. After a while, I grew fatigued of searching around. The smell of blood was overwhelming, and I became disenchanted with it. So, I headed back home with a few others. I wasn't sorry at all. I felt content. The soldiers had come to harm our families and us, and this was our land. When I was in the brush with the Hunkpapas and the first shots were fired, I had a sense that this would transpire. I believed my people were connected to the thunder beings in my vision, and that the soldiers were foolish to come here. Everyone stayed up all night in the village. The next morning, another war party went back to the hill where the soldiers were, and the men who had been watching there all night returned home. My mother and I went along. She rode a mare with a little colt trotting beside her, following its mother. We could see the horses and pack mules up there, but the soldiers were well fortified. At the base of the hill, on the west side of the Greasy Grass, there were some bullberry bushes. A big boy named Roundfool was running around the bushes. We asked him what he was doing, and he said, "There's a white man in that bush." And there was. He had hidden there when the other soldiers retreated to the hilltop and had been there all night. We commenced shooting arrows at him, and it felt akin to chasing a rabbit. He crawled from one side of the bush to the other while we ran around, discharging our bows at him. At one point, he exclaimed, "Ow!" After a while, we set fire to the grass surrounding the bushes, and he emerged, running. Some of our warriors slew him. Once we ascended the rear of the hill where some of our men were stationed, we looked over. We couldn't espy the soldiers who were lying in their defenses, but we could see the horses and pack mules, many of which were deceased. When we returned down and crossed the river again, some soldiers fired at us, striking the water. It was almost dusk when my mother and I returned to the camp by swift horseback. By then, our scouts had reported that more soldiers were approaching up the stream, so we decided to break camp. Before dark, we were packed up and began heading up the Greasy Grass towards Woodlouse Creek in the Bighorn Mountains. We fled through the night, following the Greasy Grass. My mother threw some puppies into the pony drag that my two younger brothers and I rode in. They kept attempting to crawl out, so I spent a considerable amount of time returning them to the drag, which meant I didn't obtain much slumber. We arrived at a tiny dry brook by daylight, established camp, and feasted abundantly. The meat had patches of fat in it, and I wish I had some of it at this very moment. By midday, we set off again and reached Woodlouse Creek at the base of the mountains, where we set up camp. There, 3 bears, a man with grievous wounds, went into convulsions and kept repeating, "Genini, Genini." I am uncertain about his meaning. He eventually succumbed, and we came to call that place the camp where Genini died. That evening, everyone became agitated and started shouting, "The soldiers are coming!" I glanced over and saw what appeared to be troops approaching our way, but it turned out to be some of our own men attired in soldiers' uniforms. They were merely indulging in merriment. The scouts reported that the soldiers hadn't followed us and that everything was safe now. Throughout the camp, there were large fires and kill dances transpiring all night. I hope this first-hand account gives you a new perspective on the Battle of Little Bighorn and the Great Sioux War of 1876. Stay tuned for more videos like this. I hope to bring you more first-hand accounts of different battles, so have a great day, and I'll see you next time.